Welcome to a Sweet Savor Bible School. Thank you for watching. My name is James Reinars, and this is a clip from a Zoom class I taught recently on the history of Christian hymns, with a focus on singing devotionally. There were several parts to the class, but these clips are just of the lecture portion. More information can be found in the description.
W.E. Broadman and these two Smiths began to travel. They traveled to Europe. They held dozens of small meetings in drawing rooms and over breakfast with 30s and 40s, all over England and Europe in the 1870s, 1872, 73, 74. And then that began to stir up a desire for conventions, conferences that were a little bigger. So the first formal one they had, there was just 100 people. But what was interesting is it was all leaders hungering for more in their Christian life. They all were preaching the gospel or doing things all day long, but realizing I need something more. So they came to this kind of meeting in a larger group. So many people were helped. Evan Hopkins, some of the hymn writers were going to sing shortly. They asked for another one, I think 3 months later at the end of the summer. Next one, there was 1,000 people. There was 3 weeks between the announcement of that conference and when they actually had it, and 1,000 people showed up. Again, mostly leaders, mostly ministers, professionals, educated folk, that kind of thing. People were hungry. They were leading a flock, but they themselves didn't have a secret. So this began to grow. It wasn't called the Keswick Convention at first. It was in Broadlands and then Oxford and then Brighton and then lastly at Keswick. But even then, it was a grassroots movement. Again, Pearsall Smith and these ones were traveling all over Europe, and people were find a way. No one called this Keswick really until 10 or 15 years after a Keswick Convention. This was just something that was spreading over the world through many people, many teachers, many ministers. And the convention at Keswick eventually became the largest one, the one that could kind of be a mother to them all, or people looked to as a little bit more of a summing up, even though there were other annual and regular and well-known ones in England itself. So it's really just something that was sweeping the Christian world at that time and became known as a Keswick thing. We're going to do two things before we go to our breakout room, because there's so much with anything that's worth talking about. There's way too much to be said. We're going to get away from the people, away from the history, and just step back and look at their method and what they did, because that was kind of as unique and as crucial as what they taught. The method is what brought power and people into the reality of their teaching. Broadly speaking, for the conference, how they handled things, how they picked message speakers or whatnot. They had these principles. All the preaching was Bible-centered. It wasn't that the speakers were not doctors of divinity or theological types, but they all agreed that they were not going to talk about things from their theological perspectives or they weren't going to bring in the little fights of the day. They were going to focus just on this specific topic of sanctification by faith and just talk about the Bible, not all this other stuff. They really considered the time a spiritual clinic, a time where sin as a disease could be considered as a disease, and even unrepentant sin or lingering sin in Christians could be considered, and they could come to the clinic. All the speakers were just known to be available at all times throughout the day to take small audiences with people where they could the real work of the conference could be done. People could come hear a couple of messages about sin and realize I don't know how to deal with what's in me, and then they could have coffee with H.C. Mula or some of these other important people who were there, and they could really shepherd them to deal with their spiritual woes. They only picked preachers who could personally testify to a definite experience of what they were talking about. That was a real hallmark of everything. It was ecumenical, meaning it was just kind of pulling from all sides of the church. It wasn't just Anglican, it wasn't just Puritans, it wasn't just it wasn't just Baptist. Because of their previous focuses, and they were not focusing on any one church or trying to get people out of one system to another, they could really unite together just under Jesus. And it really pulled from all different walks of Christianity at that time. And even though they had a real pattern and people prepared important messages, they really gave a lot of room for the Spirit to have freedom. There's accounts of, one person sharing so much about the need to confess sin, and the second person right after them has a message he knows can follow that, but he just realizes this may not be right, right? So then he gets up on the podium, doesn't say a word of his message, and just leads everybody in to confess their sins for an hour. There's a lot of great stories like that where just unique things, moments of consecration, moments of the whole room crying and confessing sins to each other, or whatever. The Spirit had room for that kind of thing in these conferences. Lastly, their preaching generally had a template. It was a 5-day conference, and generally each day had a theme. And this is something they considered crucial to getting the goal of the time, spiritual breakthrough, finding, either they could call it a second blessing or a secret of victory. There were some steps that had to be walked through. So people needed to see, especially Christians needed to see that their sin still matters. Their sin is still sin, and it's still a problem. Even your avarice towards your neighbor is really a barrier between you and God using you for his kingdom. So they would talk about sin, talk about God's complete provision for sin. And then that's often where things like confession, so that just all of holiness, all of sanctification maybe could come in, whole day on the need to yield all of one's life to the Lord, consecration. You can see where Frances Havergal really, fit in her influence and her experience of these things here. That really made room after all that emptying for someone to be filled with the Spirit. And they could learn to walk with him and talk about how to walk with him in a way that is not just focused on being freed from sin, but actually ministering to those around. So then there could be calls to mission or calls to Christian service in one's own life. This was the regular template, kind of, though they tried not to follow it rigidly. Maybe one topic would go a day and a half or be less than a day or whatever. But in general, they brought people through this progression. Any questions? That's kind of it for the history. There's a lot. I maybe I'll talk about it next week. I don't know. There's a lot of different individuals. I haven't said a lot more about the history, but trying to show a bigger picture of kind of its spiritual influence that still has impact on us today. Any kind of questions or anything I should go a little more into detail about? The first hymnal that was used for Keswick was written the year before at one of the Pre-Keswick Conventions. So it shows that right away in the psyche of the group of people. Evan Hopkins, there's a French guy named Theodore we'll learn about, James Mountain, Lucy Bennett, Mary Maxwell, this group. They're thinking about how to flesh this out into a whole conference. Not only is there are some anecdotes from the early days, even before that 100-person conference, there was a group of maybe 12 or 15 together, knowing that they were touching something real in the Spirit, but really thinking about how do we bring people into this? What should our method be? And they were kind of working out what we were just talking about in the previous 2 slides. That group also would recognize, singing is a part, and we need songs to back that up. We need songs to lead people into recognizing their sin, songs to lead people into confession, lead people into consecration. A song like Channels Only is really about, now that once sin and things is left, I just desire to be a channel for the Lord to move through, right? So actually there's a lot of songs that fit these kind of parameters that we haven't really touched with Charles Wesley in the same way, or John Newton in the same way. So some of them were originally written, but again, there's not one hallmark hymn writer. There's not one Charles Wesley to the John Wesley who really fulfilled all the musical and hymn needs of the people at this time. Evan Hopkins, I think Evan Hopkins becomes the real kind of theologian of the movement to back it up with teaching. But I think he only wrote 2 hymns. We will learn both his hymns. They're both really good, but I think he only wrote 2. Other people really only wrote a few. So to that end, people were writing songs. There's a clear need for music. And even before this was a clearly established movement, they had put together a hymnal. So it shows like a real awareness to the need of hymns, that they were working towards having that more and more.
Well, that's the end of our section. You can learn more about a Sweet Savor Bible School on our website, link in the description. There you can find course descriptions and find out how you can join the next class. And for now, I'll say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. May Jesus bless you, and may we become a savor that is pleasing to our God.